Okay, well, welcome everybody, and I hope you're all safe and healthy at home and enjoying your Friday, or as the case may be, your Saturday, since some of you are in other time zones. I'm really pleased to see so many people involved in this webinar today. We actually, honestly, when I set it up, I figured we'd get a few dozen, and we've already got well over 150 people online right now, which makes it a little challenging because we set it up as a meeting rather than a formal webinar. So I'd like to ask you as participants to listen in, keep yourself muted. I have set it up so it's possible to unmute. If you have questions, really try to hold them till the end if we can, just I think for the sake of all of our sanity, but please type them into the chat window, and we will address the questions as best we can as we go along. I'm Harold Tobin from the University of Washington. I'm chairing the SZ4D Umbrella Research Coordination Steering Committee, and you can see the names of the other members of that steering committee on the screen now. We'll just try to take, about 35-40 minutes to present a little bit about what SZ4D is all about and where it's headed and what some of the recent activities have been. We are still being very much an active group despite all of our stay-home orders all over the world. I know that many of you, probably most of you, are at least partially familiar with SZ4D, have been maybe participants in some of our town hall meetings before or seen other things. So I will do some introduction at the beginning. Bear with me for a part of that. I think you will see that there will be plenty of new information as well about what the interest in working groups are getting up to now in the SZ4D world. Without further ado then, I will go ahead. And I will say also that I'm speaking very much on behalf of the other members of the steering committee and the leaders of the thematic working groups that SZ4D has. And many of those people are online right now, and they may help me answer questions at the end as well. So SZ4D, Subduction Zones Through Space and Time, or Subduction Zones in 4 Dimensions, is a planning group. It is an activity that is sponsored by the National Science Foundation, has a number of different facets, and it's really about thinking about a new initiative for a decadal scale vision in subduction zone science. And let me get the little laser pointer going, make it a little easier to point. Okay, there we go. So the SZ4D, really emerged from discussions of a subduction zone observatory that went on through actually a lot of the past decade or so, and culminated in many ways with the publication of this document called the SZ4D Initiative, Understanding the Processes that Underlie Subduction Zone Hazards in 4D, or we usually refer to it just simply as the vision document that Jeff McGuire and Terry Plank led up the writing of. This in turn emerged from a very large workshop that was held a few years back now in late 2016 in Boise, Idaho, that really tried to imagine, what might be at the scale of our grandest vision, what a large-scale initiative through the National Science Foundation and NASA and other USGS and other agencies in the US in particular, and in fact, with global partnerships might be for advancing subduction zone science, and recognizing that it was time to really think about some very new emphases and approaches in subduction zone science. So some of the themes that really emerged from that meeting were to keep the focus very much on fundamental science, but the fundamental processes that underlie the societal impacts or the geohazards that emerge from subduction zone events and activities. And thinking about the fact that we are really in an era of just remarkable new technologies, new technology-driven discovery, and therefore that new kinds of time-evolving phenomena and 4D data sets were a way for the future to really move forward on understanding these next big leaps in the processes underlying subduction zone hazard. So all of these things, including the integration, as I'll talk about, of geology, geophysics, modeling, experimental geoscience together in a national and international framework to really push this thing forward. So it doesn't lack certainly for the grand scale of vision. So a theme might be, sort of to encapsulate all that, collecting data sets in 4D 4D meaning both real time, meaning as processes are going on, because we are looking at sort of present day geologic hazard in real time, and through geologic time in terms of understanding the history behind them, in order to really increase our understanding, or our predictive understanding, of the things that are most relevant to societal impact. And the three that are listed here, tsunamis and earthquakes, eruptions, and landslides, are easy target focuses. But again, I want to reemphasize that focus on the fundamental processes that underpin and underlie these things that take place. So the vision document includes recommendation for basically a kind of a three-pronged approach to what an SZ4D program might look like. And there's a timeline in there that we are partway down in terms of a planning process for a decadal scale vision. But it really boils down to these three elements, a vision for what a science program might look like. What is the big science that would be done through an SZ4D program? What infrastructure is needed? Specifically, what kinds of new measurements, new observations, or new physical infrastructure out there in the world would help achieve the kind of vision of the science behind this program? And then a very tight collaboration, or very tight integration of numerical and physical modeling of the processes that we're interested in on the very large, sort of subduction zone Earth scale. So these elements are in progress, and there are active planning groups. I'm going to talk about, actually briefly, first about the modeling collaboratory, and then about the Umbrella Research Coordination Network, which is NSF's sort of name or designation for these planning programs, that is taking up the question of what should the science program and potentially the infrastructure look like. So following that document, I think that document was recognized as a grand vision, but the question emerged of sort of how would that vision be turned into an implementation plan, a blueprint for actually doing something real in the real world through the various funding agencies involved. So the National Science Foundation funded proposals for three major activities, actually, as you can see, more than three activities, but specifically these RCNs, or Research Coordination Networks, which is an NSF designation. The umbrella, we call it RCN, or the overall SZ4D RCN that I'm speaking on behalf of today, the modeling collaboratory, and then also a volcanic rapid response or eruption response network called Converse that we'll briefly mention a few minutes later. So NSF really put in a very significant commitment to these planning activities, and really across a lot of both the earth and ocean sciences. It's a hallmark, I think, of the way we're thinking about this planning process. Along with that, one specific element that we'll get into talking about the infrastructure a little bit is the funding this past fall, essentially late last year, of an instrument pool for seafloor geodesy, and the potential for a number of GPSA transponders for the seafloor to be used as an instrument pool to go out and do significant measurements of the underwater geodetic environment, of course, in subduction zones and potentially other places as well. And there's a group that is designing and working on what that instrument pool is. I understand that they will have a community workshop. It's been delayed a little bit because of the current pandemic situation, but coming this fall, plan to have a real sort of major input workshop for that pool. Okay, I'll talk about the modeling collaboratory just a little bit. And the MCS, or Modeling Collaboratory for Subduction Zone Science, is headed up by Torsten Becker at University of Texas. It has a steering committee of its own with a number of people really looking at how to bring together and integrate observation and the modeling and simulation to make the next big leaps forward in understanding the fundamental physics underlying the variety of subduction zone processes, volcanic, earthquake and megathrust processes, surface evolution and topography, all the way down to hazards like landslide. And so they are working hard on putting together a kind of a network of people that would integrate the results of, and in some cases actually the models of all of those different kinds of processes. The Modeling Collaboratory has been very active recently and has done a number of things. The Modeling Collaboratory sponsored several workshops that some of you probably were in attendance for. The Fluid and Melt Transport one in Minneapolis last year, the Megathrust faulting and earthquake processes modeling workshop that was held in Eugene in October, and the upcoming volcano modeling workshop, which if I understand correctly from the latest word, is still planned to go ahead as a virtual workshop in July instead of in person as was originally planned. I think there's additionally planning for a smaller scale workshop on surface processes as well. So SZ4D Modeling Collaboratory has a website listed down there, and you'll be able to take a look at that for more information and reports from these various workshops as they go along. They've also been holding a series of collaborative science webinars. It's been really interesting, bringing together or bringing people who have done significant collaborations across geoscientific disciplines and really talking about how those collaborations have evolved and how they've worked along the way. And so all of these have happened in the past few months, and I participated in some of them. They've been really good, and those are recorded online and available. I meant to say at the beginning that this workshop that we're in right now is also being recorded, and we will make it available on the SZ4D website soon after today, as soon as we get it sort of edited and uploaded. Okay, so that's the Modeling Collaboratory. Now the umbrella or the overarching SZ4D Research Coordination Network has been charged essentially with turning that vision document into an implementation plan for an SZ4D initiative. And an implementation plan is a more complicated thing to think about doing than simply just sort of saying that the vision document lays out grand challenges and overall strategies, but not really anything like a blueprint for how to actually implement it and at what scale and with what emphases. So the scale and scope is kind of an open question, and frankly, it's a complex question because there is no specific model that we follow or program, let's say, that SZ4D can apply to. Things that are at a large scale, especially if they involve large infrastructure components that are expensive, really have to be developed out of kind of whole cloth in a way, similar to perhaps if you think about the way EarthScope was developed or something like that. It would certainly, the vision includes having an infrastructure program, a research program with a series of targets and emphases, and hopefully a stable funding stream over a long period of time for PIs to be involved in the science of. Data management, collaboratories like the Modeling Collaboratory and perhaps others in other areas of the research. So all of that is still to be designed. The way that has to happen then, or the way we've designed it to take place in the umbrella RCN, is with these thematic interest groups and working groups that are charged with actually taking each of the key theme areas, I'll explain those in just a second, and design a program, design what the elements that we see as the leading vision for a program that you could actually actualize some of the SZ4D goals. And then use that to work with our partners in the funding agencies and all of the other allied groups. These are just some of the US organizations that would be most likely involved, and it's certainly not an exclusive list. So, how do we get to this thing of doing the science of processes underlying those subduction zone geohazards? And there are challenges, right? NSF in particular has emphasized to us that the initiative has to certainly be, it starts as bold, but it also has to be focused and recognized as something genuinely new and not simply perhaps an attempt to do, the sequel to one of the previous large-scale programs without really thinking it through. And a need for flexibility in the scale and scope because there is no crystal ball for what kind of ambition one might have for the cost, for example, of such a program. And certainly the events of recent months perhaps throw even more uncertainty in what the long-term costs are for big-scale programs. either positive or negative. I don't know. On one hand, there's sort of the idea that the government will be very lean all over the world for a long time, and the flip side of that perhaps is stimulus programs. And then I certainly don't have a crystal ball for those. Certainly, they've emphasized the need to be ready to use opportunities that might arise, like the mid-scale research infrastructure call that took place last year, looking for programs in the several million to $60 or $80 million range. And I'm just going to make sure. Okay, got it. I'm just checking on the chat there. And I'm losing my mouse, of course, as well, because these things are not simple. Okay, sorry. So, the compelling science is really what's needed to justify and suggest it, and then to literally sell it, right? So one of the big elements is vision of infrastructure. Physical infrastructure and intellectual infrastructure are both called out in the vision document. And by that, we really mean, both the facilities and the large-scale data programs that might be necessary, including perhaps rapid response capabilities to something like a volcanic eruption or an emerging surface process crisis or a major earthquake or something like that. And all of the things that go along with that, including laboratory and computational facilities. And then also the infrastructure of sort of human resources, meaning the scientists, the science program, how should it be structured, what should it focus on, and how do we build a cohesive and engaged scientific community. Okay, so you could boil all that down to say that the job of the RCN, in a way, the SZ4D group, is to propose something that the funding agencies just have to find a way because it's so exciting or compelling to the scientific community. Maybe that's a large charge or a grand way of saying it, but I think of it that way. So how are we going about then developing from the vision into some sort of an implementation plan? And that's really what I'm going to spend the rest of the time kind of talking about here. First of all, of course, there is a website, SZ4D.org, and if you haven't had a chance to take a look at that, please do. A lot of what we're doing is going up there. It's sort of rapidly evolving. The content will continue to grow, but there's information there to back up what I'm saying today. On the website, there are links to a series of interest groups, and the interest groups are really just designed around three big meant to be inclusive themes. It's not easy to think of a name for each interest group that doesn't sound like it excludes some subset of the community, but in fact, the goal is really to be very much inclusive across all of these areas. Still trying to close the chat window that is on my screen, which makes it difficult for me to see past it. But apparently, my mouse just doesn't want to go there while I'm in the presentation. Okay, so the interest groups are really broad and inclusive. And if you haven't signed up for one or more of the interest groups on the website, go ahead and do so. From those interest groups, we've drawn smaller teams who are both willing to and had the right mix of sort of expertise and everything to actually be the people who kind of have to do the real work, meaning come together, take the input from the interest groups, take the input from the broader community, think about the vision, and turn it into an implementation plan. And so there are currently 3 working groups with plans afoot for developing the international working group, as well as some of the most basic sort of scientific plans come to a little bit more mature level and go on from there. All right, there we go. So what status is the implementation plan system in? And in just a minute, I will introduce those 3 working groups that are already meeting and working, and spend a little bit of time on what each of them sort of have identified as the key paths forward for their working group. But first, just a little bit of a timeline. So many of you may have been at the town hall at the AGU conference this past year. We followed that up in January, just before the world changed for most of us, with an in-person working group meeting. It's hard to even imagine in-person meetings right now, it seems. But we all came together in a group of about 60 or 70 people in Albuquerque in January and kicked off the working group meetings. So we actually had each of them together in one place. Now they're taking kind of what was developed at that first meeting and continuing to meet virtually as working groups. Each one has between a dozen and 16 or 17 people in it, and devising ways to seek that specific input from the community. And I'll talk about that in just a minute, on the potential for, you know, themes, experiments, geographic focus sites for eventual research, and so on. So they're meeting regularly online. Most of the working groups are meeting at least monthly online right now. We've been planning to have a late summer in-person meeting. Of course, it's a little bit up in the air right now whether that will happen, but certainly they will continue to develop and work on those plans. By actually AGU time, we intend to seek a lot more input. We have workshops and special events going on when conferences start happening again, or with some of the virtual conferences coming up this year. We do plan to have another working group and steering committee in-person meeting around 1 year after that Albuquerque meeting, and try to start coalescing some plans and do the writing on drafting some of the implementation plan work in that time. Put it out there through the website to the community and seek input on those draft plans, and build towards a late 2021 sort of finalization of what some of these things would actually look like and be. And, you know, the timeline can change because of the just the changing nature of what sort of the long range visions of the funding agencies are. Just as an example, right now, especially the EAR part of NSF is looking very closely at what's going to be in the coming CORS report from the National Academies on emphases for earth science going forward in the future, and seeing to what degree this kind of subduction zone science will or will not be kind of a focus in that area. So I'm going to now spend a little time with each of the three working groups. I won't really be able to do full justice to them, especially the ones that I am less directly personally involved in the science of, so I apologize to the working group leaders if I say anything wrong or crazy in the next few minutes, but we have those leaders online and we'll be able to have them help out with answering questions that might come up. So the first one I'll talk about is the one that is titled Magmatic Drivers of Eruption. And this is really, you know, the working group that's focused on understanding eruptive processes and the drivers of them, in fact. And notice that in the subset of the website, there is more information there to get involved in. Here's the Magmatic Drivers Working Group. The members at the top from the steering committee are the ones really leading that effort in this magmatic and volcanoes side. And then there are a number of working group members from a number of different universities, USGS, et cetera, across the US. Our working groups, by the way, are US working groups so far, and that's really because we are doing a project where we're designing this for a national effort. That does not mean that there's any less focus on the potential that this is going to go to a fully international, engaged, and integrated effort. But we need to speak to our community in the US system and get people to come to consensus, I think, on a lot of these things. So the Magmatic Drivers Group is focused on some really overarching questions, and I'll try to give you the overarching questions across each of the three. How do transcrustal processes drive eruptions at arc volcanoes? And so really, you know, there's a series of hypotheses listed here, and in some way they get to being about what are the initiation mechanisms, external and internal, to The reason I'm struggling every once in a while is because I have part of the screen covered up with the group chat window. And since I'm using, maybe if I turn off the laser pointer thingy, I'll just go back to normal, and then yes, I'll be able to close it. Okay, sorry for the technical difficulty there. It's a lot easier for me to see what's on my screen now. Back to it. Driving hypotheses about the initiation by internal and external mechanisms of eruption, you know, things that are going on within the magmatic system and things that are environmental conditions essentially in the mantle and crust that surrounds it. How they produce the kinds of drivers for failure that lead to eruption, and the specifics, you know, of failure conditions depend on specifics of that system. And so we need to know a lot about any given volcanic system or the range of potential systems that there are. And all of those mechanisms then are governing eruption style composition, the volume, and what the unrest behavior looks like, or the run up from quiescence to active transport. So, you know, there's a whole range of things, and I won't go through all of these kind of questions, but this slide just gives you a flavor for you know, all of the kinds of questions that working group is asking and trying to develop a program that will address. How do we relate these different things, different kinds of processes, and how do we relate them specifically to potential precursors and forecast models? So, so those are the kinds of questions that are being addressed. They're tied in very closely to these allied efforts. I mentioned the Converse project that has been going on with Tobias Fischer heading it up, the rapid response RCN potential for eruptions. And so those are closely allied pieces of these things, and Converse is, I think, also had a postponed meeting till later this year, and one of a series of meetings actually. The modeling collaboratory, of course, plays a role in all of that, experiments and looking at volcano systems, both present day, obviously, but also, you know, exhumed or deeper roots of volcanic systems like plutonic systems. A lot of things talking about really what are the enabling technologies that are changing the game. And so there's just some examples there, like drones or unmanned vehicles, muon tomography, and so on, gas detectors. So trying to bring together what the range of things are. And the working group is very much concerned with what are the kinds of implementation strategies that might be used. And so they've sort of got the whole enchilada versus the many tacos approaches here, which it emerged from having a meeting in New Mexico, I'm sure. But thinking about, you know, certain subsets of volcanoes where you would select ones that had promising features that you would that are actively deforming and that you look at very closely, and consider the most useful arrays of sensors for petrologic studies. And then potentially the big picture where you really choose a backbone of certain systems that you go after with all the toolkit that you can bring to bear on the same system. And then the rapid response as well. So, you know, all of these as coordinated things, and part of their design effort is going to be to figure out what the balance of these different approaches is. So, you know, look at the website. They have produced, that group has produced a survey, which will be a great way for you to become an engaged person as part of the interest group, to let them know what your interests are and what your either expertise or specific research interest is. And they're going to follow that up with additional surveys and webinars that are going to, you know, take up certain among these topics and really seek very broad community input. So use the survey. It's there's a link to it on the web, on the SZ4D.org website right now. And join the interest group. And if you're a Twitter user, follow SZ4D on Twitter. I should have said that sooner, maybe. This applies actually to all of the groups. There are plans for a GSA set of linked thematic sessions in SZ4D. It's not clear whether GSA will be in person, online, or postponed at this point. But right now the plans are for those sessions to go ahead. And we will see related themes in Town Hall at AGU as well. Okay, the next group I want to talk about is the Faulting and Earthquake Cycles Working Group. And I want to emphasize right at the outset that the processes the discussion is going to focus a lot kind of on megathrust processes, the largest and most damaging earthquakes and the ones most likely to produce the tsunami. But really the working group is very much considering holistically the entire faulting system and kind of the tectonic deformation associated with the subduction zone, you know, again, with an eye towards the processes underlying geohazard, but not focused solely on specifically, let's say, megathrust rupture. So that Faulting and Earthquake Working Group is really headed up in particular by Emily Brodsky and Donna Shillington, number of other members who are part of the steering committee overall, and then a number of other working group members that really represent a range of people involved in a full spectrum of research activity, from geophysics to you know, geological exhumed systems, experiments, and so on. Paleoseismology to strong motion to source processes. And so that group is really looking at, you know, a number of different things, and there are a couple of different ingredients that seem especially engaging in this time in 2020 and looking forward. And one is just the explosion of potential for observational systems. We have fantastic networks that have developed on land in many subduction zones. There are many ways in which those also need to have either enhancements, densifications, modernizations, but also the explosion of information from offshore events, and recognizing that new seafloor instrumentation, you know, is showing us things we couldn't see before, and that since these fault systems for megathrust systems are largely in the offshore environment, these are game changers for potentially understanding, let's say, the pre, you know, co and post seismic deformation and processes going on in a subduction zone system, as well as you know, events like slow slip phenomena that are illustrated there, and many other things. There's a recognition at the same time that there's an integration across you know, geology, geophysics, and a whole range of approaches that are needed in order to integratively understand the signals that might come from those observational networks. So 3 examples on this slide include, you know, large scale on the left, dynamic rupture simulation for a subduction zone event. You know, that's the numerical simulation at the kind of largest fault rupture scale. Included in that need to be properties that are informed from geophysical imaging and inferred sediment properties or rock properties in the fault zone environment, all the way down to the geology of faults, in this case illustrated by core samples from Japan Trench, and or, you know, exhumed rocks like these mixed blue schist eclogites in the background of this slide, tied to experiments and laboratory of, you know, information on, let's say, friction or other deformational processes, and what we get out of the imaging. So linking of all of those things together. So the working group is working on, you know, taking the list of questions that started out from the SZ4D vision document and turning them into the ones that are really distilled down to be the questions that are most exciting, but also the most addressable, most answerable. Actually, all of the working groups are working on traceability matrices, which is a phrase that wasn't that familiar to me before we got going with this process, but a way of thinking about, you know, how do you connect the dots? What actual observations, experiments, and models are needed and are most useful to actually address the questions that you're asking, and how to develop some kind of prioritization of what science you're actually trying to do in a large scale program. I'll show you an example in just a second. This group is also spending time developing an inventory of the attributes and available data from a range of subduction zones to try to start to think about the geographic locations that are needed. And this is not the only group that's doing an inventory as well right now as part of their major working group activities. Along with subduction zones, then a second inventory of onshore analogs, and technical capabilities that are going to be needed, that are emerging now that we can't quite do, or that with the right investment in technology we would be able to do. So putting all that together for a basis for making, the community decisions. So here are some of the kind of distilled questions that are still evolving, and the working group seeks feedback from the broader community on what controls speed and mode of slip in space and time, distinctive precursory or foreshock slip, the physical conditions for rapid slip, in particular that displaces the seafloor, and so the potential for tsunami source. And how does the entire sort of family or system of faults interact with each other and with the plate boundary to produce the overall plate boundary deformation that we see. So the traceability matrix looks, just in small parts, something like this. Questions are the rows are defined by questions, and then there are columns that are different kinds of potential observations, and rankings and comments are going on in the group as they're developing this traceability matrix to look at what are all the kinds of things. And the matrix itself is actually very broad with quite a few columns right now, and is developing and evolving. And the group is creating a subduction zone inventory. So in fact, Thornley and Rob Witter have been working really hard on putting together an inventory. You can see the SLAB 2.0 models in here, but also a great deal of other information embedded in this database that's building up, including these kind of things that are in the bullet points down here at the base. Along with this modern subduction zone inventory, it's recognized very clearly that understanding faulting processes in inaccessible parts of the Earth requires working with onshore analogs, places where the fault systems are exhumed. And there are many examples of that, and these just give some examples from looking at what the conditions that you can access by looking at exhumed analogs are in PT space, or thinking about it geometrically down the subduction system. Okay, so that group is really thinking about what are the potential implementation strategies, and some of the objectives, of course, are really ambitious, thinking about putting significant numbers of instruments, let's say, into the seafloor, for example, or large-scale new efforts in experimentation and modeling and so on. But the implementation strategy ultimately has to be based on that traceability matrix and the crucial needs. So some of the key components, and these are really just examples, and again, not meant to be exclusive, are the geodetic and seismic measurements, and the coordinated community science for all of the things that help us understand those things. And if the thing that you think should be on that list is not there, then this is the place to start engaging with that working group through the interest group sign up, through the website and the surveys that will be coming soon on these topics. Okay, the third working group is landscapes and seascapes. And that is where the surface processes and subduction group, with this fantastic naming, I think, that really reflects the link of the surface to all of the things that are really driving deformation, energy transfer in the subduction system. So the interface, in a way, the linking thing that is between the megathrust and the arc is the surface processes. And of course, the surface is where we live and we inhabit it. And so therefore, those linkages are very much central to our interaction with the subduction system. So there are many different sort of nested questions also for this group, but they're, they kind of fall into two major categories about the dynamics of the system and how those things contribute to hazard. So the working group is here. The working group leaders from the steering committee are George Hilly and Allison Duval. And again, a cast of fantastic people who have devoted a lot of time already and are going to continue to devote time to developing really an implementation plan for these particular parts of the activities here. So some of the big, sort of overarching scale questions this working group has developed. Can we anticipate the impacts of subduction zone earthquakes and volcanic eruptions on sediment generation and transport, so how sediment moves, and that encompasses the thing that was on that slide early on, like something obvious like landslides, but also all the other ways in which surficial materials are moved and transferred around the subduction system. And how do they produce these cascading and persistent impacts as that material is transported? And then maybe even in some ways the sort of the larger and more encompassing set of questions that group is addressing are distilled into this one. What fraction of the subduction zone's energy budget goes into shaping the landscape and the seascape, right? So how is permanent deformation created? How is it absorbed into the upper plate? How does it create mass transport, uplift and erosion, strain throughout the crust, and so on? And so this, this sort of conceptual equation of energy balances is key to the way that group is thinking about subduction zone hazard. And an emphasis in this group, again, this is a theme that all three groups are hitting, is the fact that we are at a moment of technology-enabled discovery that perhaps is kind of unprecedented. Advances in remote sensing. So here are examples of high-resolution seafloor bathymetric mapping, high-resolution drone-based, LiDAR-based, et cetera, surface mapping on land, translating into more, high-resolution, quantitative, and process-focused imaging that goes along with stuff like recognizing that you can use, computational resources to take advantage of all these new observational tools. So certainly this statement could be made about the whole program. Technology-enabled discovery is a cornerstone. All right. So how you can get involved in the landscapes and seascapes effort, I'm going to hit the same themes that we've said with some of the other groups. If you go to the website, you will actually see that they have some narrative documents with input boxes. This is just a screenshot, but if you click that, you see the narrative document, and there's a place to actually provide feedback. And so they're very interested in getting opinions and support there. There's a Twitter account, Surf and Turf, I love it, SZ4D Surf and Turf. And so follow them on Twitter, and there will be upcoming webinars specific to this group as well, so that the working group can get input from the interest group. All right, so SZ4D overarching across all of the groups is going to need to include major decisions about how data policies are managed, and how data, in fact, will be managed in a modern world. There's a very strong commitment to an open model for data that emerges from an effort of this kind of scale and scope, so it's not an easy thing. And finally, perhaps SZ4D has a very strong emphasis on, or will have a very strong emphasis on outreach and capacity building. We're at the early stages. So frankly, we haven't done a lot of the first level here, for example, bringing new content to the public domain. That's really part of what our planning charge is to design what SZ4D might do. Certainly, that also will include taking it to stakeholders. Right now, probably the focus is largely on beginning the first stage of really what we're calling in-reach, just meaning building the intellectual infrastructure, building the research community for SZ4D. And very soon, the emphasis will also build onto international capacity building, right? Working together with partners, both in the sense of partnership and transfer of skills, and that's really in all directions. Between both the US and other nations that are doing large amounts of research, other nations that host subduction zone systems, and really sort of the whole fabric that entails. Okay, so again, just to hammer it home some more, becoming involved in the SZ4D community means participating, and we are exhorting everyone to do as much participation as is possible. We're doing a webinar right now, so this is sort of our kickoff of a webinar series that's coming. We actually had made plans to start with more of these in March and April here, and as the coronavirus situation got going, I think we recognized that everybody who is busy scrambling to teach online or just living up to here with Zoom meetings probably didn't need a whole series of them right away. So we've decided to start really in June after most of us are just past the end of our semester. So you can watch for announcements of other webinars with specific topical focuses coming up. I already mentioned the GSA. Please, and mentioning again, if you haven't signed up for the interest groups, do it, because we're going to use that listserv and other communication methods to get surveys out, get feedback from you, and get updates to you from the working groups as they do their work. Some of the working groups are starting Slack channels as well, and other, sort of full-time feedback systems. So I can't emphasize this enough. Any successful SZ4D program is going to be built by and be responsive to the research community, right? And the other thing I really want to emphasize is that none of this is a given. We are a planning group, and all we've got funding to do is do planning. The National Science Foundation does not have an SZ4D program, has not made any commitment to an SZ4D program. It's an initiative, and we have the challenge to design something exciting. And encapsulating it as something amphibious, so it's pretty clear that the land and sea, earth are both involved. That infrastructure, observation, modeling, experiment, and really great science are all envisioned, and that we have to, make the pitch probably at multiple scales, because no one knows exactly what the future holds, to do the best things that we can as an SZ4D initiative. So our job, is to design a great program. So with that, I will stop talking, and I will attempt to go to what's come up in the chat. If you have questions, please add them to the chat now. And Natalie's going to help me if I miss things along the way. So I'm going to scroll back through it just a little bit. Okay. Torsten Becker points out that the Modeling Collaboratory Volcano Workshop is in fact still TBD, but they're not sure which way they're going to do it and going to decide over the next few weeks. I see great comments on, let's see, okay, IAVC 2021 is probably shifted to 2022. Roughly a year after the first working group meeting. So that's good to know. We need to stay on top of that. I will see if there are questions evolving about some of the specifics that are in there. Yeah, we don't know about upcoming in-person meetings. If you look in the chat, you'll be able to see it. There's some people posting things like, Margaret Jadamek has put on some stuff about slab geometries. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Onward, let's see. Inventories, yes. Movie streams, great, okay. All right, so I've got one that actually has a question mark at the end so far as I know. And that's from Tim Parker. How will you work in collaboration with the regional seismic and geodetic infrastructure? Well, that's in some sense, it's a great question, because we don't have the mechanics of how the process will actually take place and work. It's very clear that as geographic localities emerge as the most important kind of feature of the SZ4D, that geography will be informed in large part by what existing infrastructure there is, and then B, by what potential there is to build and enhance off of what exists, or fill in areas that really have critical scientific questions but need infrastructure. So certainly it'll be very important for the IRIS UNAVCO and future of IRIS and UNAVCO merger or future geophysical facilities to be directly engaged as we turn this thing into kind of a blueprint plan. Same goes for that infrastructure in really a whole host of potential international locations. Okay, and the international group, I didn't say a whole lot yet because we've so far not formally convened a group, but someone asked, are we going to discuss about the international group of SZ4D? And I want to make it really clear that We have actually engaged with a number of people who are potential international partners from many different countries around the world. There was a kind of a kickoff informal meeting during the AGU. We have not created a formal working group for the international part, and it's only because we wanted to not start jockeying questions about geography before we had sort of the scientific drivers further developed in advance. So that's kind of the key. Now, Mario Ruiz points out that the Latin American Caribbean Seismological Commission meeting is planned for 2021 in Quito instead of this year. That could be a very important piece of this whole thing. Links to those scientific communities is absolutely critical. I very strongly agree with all of that. Other questions? Okay. I am going to, I'm amazed that as we've been going along, the number of participants has actually grown to 190 now. We started at 150 at the beginning of the meeting. We still have a little bit of time if people do have questions. What I want to do, okay, I'll address the question that just appeared, and then what I'd like to do is invite the other steering committee members, working group leaders to speak up for anything that I may have really missed along the way. So the question has come in, what's the timeline for this project? 3-year, 5-year plan? And again, that's a great question. We are funded to complete the research coordination network effort essentially at the end of 2021. It might spill into 2022 a little bit. We've been given the guidance from the National Science Foundation that everything we're doing is on a track that they like seeing, but that it's not yet clear, you know, exactly what the kind of time frame would be for beginning a new program. As I've already said, the contours of that new program are unknown, but also the timeline is a little bit unknown. But, you know, I would say optimistically speaking that, you know, we're looking at something that might start as a real science program. Let's say 3 years is a good number to think about. It could be a little bit more time because who knows what's going to happen now with funding around the world. Yes, Bob Woodward, I want to mention the thing that you just put in the chat. I mentioned Sage Engage, and Bob mentioned, and we sent out to the SZ4D mailing list, the fact that National Science Foundation has a Dear Colleague letter out asking for people to give their feedback on what future seismic and geodetic facilities should be and should emphasize, and maybe what they might look like, what the key things you're concerned about for seismic and geodetic facilities. I think it's a June 1 target date for those responses. They're meant to just be very short, I forget, 1 or 2 page responses. So please get them into NSF if you're interested in future of geophysical facilities.
Jeff Freimuller had a question about international participation.
Okay, great. Yeah, it looks like I missed it. Now I just saw it. Is it better for international participants to join the individual working groups or have a separate international group? From Jeff Freimuller. I would say both, essentially. So definitely, I think all participants from anywhere are invited to and encouraged to join the interest groups. So sign on to the interest groups. The working group members, again, were sub-selected, and their working groups are small because we actually have in-person meetings. We have not yet decided to the extent that we might add international members to the existing working groups. We will certainly be developing an international partnerships working group as well. But for the moment, the best thing to do is add your name to those interest groups and participate as an interest group member. I know it's a lot of terminology, interest groups and working groups. And then the working groups will take that up. We will have a video recording of this webinar and we will post it on the SZ4D.org website. Somebody asked that question. And so as soon as we can distill down the video recording, we will put it online, and we're going to let people know through the listserv. Great question. Okay, from Sean Wei, how to engage science that is related to subduction zones, but not directly related to the existing working groups. For example, the slab below 100 kilometers or subslab structure. This is a key set of questions. There's no doubt that the SZ4D has a thematic design around saying the science that underlies geohazard, but that's a very broad tent, and we want to make sure we keep it so. So, for example, you know, what in the long term and even, you know, seismic cycle term governs the loading of megathrust fault zones? It's the, you know, it's the sort of the large scale processes that involve the mantle and crust, and geodynamic scales of understanding are quite important to looking at what the loading structure is for that fault. That's just one example. We could talk about more, but I think that there is a message here that, you know, SZ4D has some driving and overarching themes, but that there's a great deal of science that addresses those overarching themes beyond maybe a narrow focus in some cases. Let me ask the other working group leaders. We briefly heard Terry's voice there. Is there anybody else who wants to add something that I have left out?
Sure, this is Emily, Emily Brodsky, if you'd like. Clearly there's been a lot of interest in the international element of this, and for good reason, that it's impossible to think that whatever SZ4D does, it would by itself with US funding cover the entire globe of subduction zones. That's not happening. And so it needs to be an international partnership, and we need to be thinking about our portfolio of subduction zones globally and the greater community internationally as what we're doing as an international portfolio. And so that has to be part of what this is. What that is organizationally, operationally, as Harold says, it's been sort of kicked down the line so that we don't get too involved in geography too soon. But I just wanted to sort of mention that, you know, we do realize that that's not somehow invisible, that this needs to be an international effort and will fail if it is not.
Absolutely, and just to reiterate that too, you know, I want to point out that that the geographic part in some ways is a hard part, but on the other hand, the science drivers are really going to lead us towards specific things. Having said that, the enthusiasm of people from a number of places around the world to have participation and go along with this. I didn't get a chance to mention some of the initiatives going on in the Mediterranean as well. So there are many places around the world that there are potential for international collaborations, and moving forward, this is going to become an absolutely key piece of the whole thing. Somebody else has pointed out to me independently here that yes, there are many kinds of earthquakes beyond just, say, megathrust events or even crustal events that present hazard, intermediate depth earthquakes, potential deep earthquakes, and other things. Anybody else from the working group want to come in, chime in for last statement or two here as we reach the hour? Okay, well, I think in that case, let's say we really appreciate everyone for participating today. It's fantastic that you guys took the time to come online. I know everyone is up to here with Zoom meetings right now, and it's a Friday, so thank you very much for joining us. Stay engaged and stay tuned in, and we are hoping for very great things in the future with SZ4D.